You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 18th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme. Hezbollah counts the cost of yesterday's exploding pager attack. Also ahead. Russia orders another evacuation as Ukrainian drones find a target well inside Russia's borders. Later in the show, we'll look at why Georgia's governing party perceives political advantage in cracking down on Pride Week, and we'll ask when or if Boeing's luck is likely to change. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. 12 people are now confirmed dead in Lebanon and Syria and nearly 3,000 injured by yesterday's near-simultaneous detonation of thousands of personal pages used by Hezbollah. Though Israel has issued no official comment, it is being widely assumed that the operation was the work of Mossad. A bewildered Taiwanese pager manufacturer called Gold Apollo has directed inquiring media to a subcontractor in Budapest who seemed to have made the compromised devices. It is not yet clear when or how these pages were turned into miniature grenades. I'm joined with more from Beirut by Nicholas No, co-founder of the Beirut-based MideastWire.com. Nicholas, what was your first understanding yesterday of what was happening and I guess the scale of what was happening?
Well, of course, Lebanon and Lebanese have been through these kinds of attacks and mass casualty attacks and wars for so long. It's always kind of unclear in the first minutes or hour or 2 hours, but I think it was rapidly very clear, the clearest I've seen in 20 years, what exactly the event was. So, for example, when the Beirut port exploded, there was a lot of confusion in those hours for all of us and in the days and indeed till now about what happened exactly and what was behind it. But this seems a lot more clearer, and it was very quickly traced to pagers and very quickly ascribed to pagers and Hezbollah members or Hezbollah circles, let's say. And the rapidity of that, I think, was pretty extraordinary. But you know, with social media, et cetera, and the simultaneous nature of this, it became overwhelmingly evident what was going on.
I mean, Hezbollah is an organization which has for many years prided itself on being impenetrable and uncompromisable, and I guess very well organized, very professionally run, and impervious to the kind of compromising that, you know, a lesser organization might be susceptible to. How embarrassed will they be by this?
Well, I disagree with the first part of the premise, because Hezbollah over the last 30 years has had a number of significant intelligence penetrations by the Americans, the CIA, the Mossad, others. In the 1990s, 1992, the Secretary General was assassinated, and the new Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, took over then. In the 2000s, Imad Moghnieh, one of the most famous listed terrorists by the U.S. and others of the 1980s, was assassinated in Damascus. Over the last 11 months of the war with Israel, there have been a number of, intelligence penetrations, mistakes, etc. So Hezbollah has never claimed that it is impenetrable, although it has rested on its laurels as being extremely effective. So it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. They have never put that mark, let's say, so far. However, that said, I think the consensus that's emerging today among analysts that have followed Hezbollah for quite some time is that this is probably the most significant, or at least wide-ranging intelligence penetration that Hezbollah has seen in its history. There is arguably another example during the early days of the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel, where the Israelis claimed to have a kind of miracle, 60-minute operation where they destroyed a lot of Hezbollah's missiles. Most of us think that the evidence says to the contrary. But be that as it may, I think that yesterday's attack was the largest intelligence penetration that they've ever seen. However, you also have to measure that against those of their enemies. So this is nowhere near on the level of import that, for example, their Israeli enemy faced in intelligence failures on around October 7. So that's also something to keep in mind. We always have to keep these things in context.
Indeed so. But is there an assumption in Lebanon now that, well, I guess about the messaging behind, or the message that Israel was sending here? Is this a warning shot to Hezbollah, just saying we can do this and we can do worse if you push us further? Or is there concern that this is the kind of thing that might be the precursor to a larger operation? Because in one fell swoop, they have at least temporarily incapacitated a great many members of Hezbollah.
Possibly, they have. It's still unclear the extent. It's unclear the civilian casualties and deaths also. That's very important to say. But I think the main thing here is that it's very risky for any of us to purport to say how Hezbollah itself is internally processing this. So all I can speak to is what analysts, some Lebanese, again, the last 22 hours have been quite chaotic to try to talk to people to get their assumptions. But let's also look at the recent reporting of the last few hours, where it seems as if this narrative is emerging that Hezbollah was on the cusp of, or was in the process of discovering the tampering of these imported pagers, and that the Israelis rushed forward an operation which they much rather strategically have launched at a different point. Perhaps if this open war that we've been on the cusp of for at least 10 months, 11 months, pops off. So let's not rush to judgment about how Hezbollah is processing it, but also let's be careful about subscribing far too much in the big win by the Israelis. Two factors here. One, they were forced to use this brilliantly concealed and apparently quite extensive weapon earlier than they would have wanted to, at least on its face. We can say that seems likely, and there's reporting around that. The second thing is that the Israelis appear to have made a mistake, which they make repeatedly in Lebanon, which is a wide, indiscriminate targeting, which tends to turn their enemies into, or gives them more valorization amongst Lebanese and certainly their supportive populations. So while the actual military import of this is probably pretty limited, it doesn't seem as if any high value, quote unquote, targets were hit, but we don't know. While the military import of it also seems as if it was rushed and forced, not at the time of the Israelis choosing, the reality seems to exist that Hezbollah is going to be able to capitalize on this mass casualty and wide-scale attack across Lebanon to further secure support for its ongoing military conflict with Israel. So in that sense, I think one can read this also, an alternative reading that I'm not seeing a lot in the European and American press, is they got basically some very small-term military targets. Yes, some psychological import here and a great psychological hit for the Israelis, but that it doesn't appear to be extensive. It doesn't appear to rise to the level of strategic blows. And also it helps to solidify national support for Hezbollah. And Israel constantly has done this over many decades of occupation and war, etc. They keep on thinking that if they pressure with force and violence the larger Lebanese population and supportive populations of their enemies, that will turn people against their main object. And actually the opposite happens.
Nicholas No with MideastWire.com in Beirut. Thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is Laura Kramer with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Taiwan's tech industry has been drawn into Middle East politics after reports that the exploding pagers used in the attack on Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon were manufactured using the branding of a Taiwanese firm. Gold Apollo has denied making them and claimed a European firm produced them through a licensing deal. In the U.S., the FBI and Postal Service are investigating suspicious packages sent to election officials in 17 states. Some contained unknown substances, though no injuries have been reported. This comes amid growing threats as the U.S. prepares for the presidential election in November. The FBI and U.S. Postal Departments say they are working to determine how many letters were sent and who was behind them. And Tupperware has filed for bankruptcy. The iconic food container brand has struggled with falling sales despite efforts to appeal to younger consumers. The company's share have fallen by more than 50% this week. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Russian authorities have ordered the partial evacuation of an area of Tver Oblast, northwest of Moscow, after a massive explosion in Toropets. Ukrainian military sources claimed that their drones struck an ammunition warehouse. The attack on Toropets was part of a wave of Ukrainian drone attacks across several Russian oblasts, also including Kursk, Bryansk, Oryol, Smolensk and Belgorod. Drones travelled in the other direction as well, Ukraine claiming to have knocked down most, though a few casualties were reported. Well, I'm joined now by Ivan Necheporenko, New York Times reporter covering Russia and neighbouring countries. First of all, what do we know for sure, if anything, about what was hit in Toropets?
Well, I think it is pretty clear at this moment that a large ammunition depot that was actually very recently built, about 10 years ago, was hit and very likely destroyed. As a result of maybe a drone strike. We're not sure if it was a drone strike caused it, because the explosion was so big and the depot is supposed to be protected by concrete ceilings and walls, so it might have been something inside. But overall, it's still quite early to make any definite conclusions.
If it was what the Ukrainians claim it is, and indeed, as you say, what it seems likely to be, is that a significant blow, certainly when measured against other blows struck by Ukraine inside Russia in recent months?
Well, relative to what the Ukrainians have done before, this is, of course, a significant blow. But at the same time, we're not aware of what Russia still has in its stockpiles, and we're not aware to what extent its capabilities have been damaged relative to the overall arsenal of weapons that Russia possesses. Of course, Russia also produces weapons, and Russia also imports arms from other countries, such as North Korea, such as Iran. So this is a very fluid situation, and of course, it's a serious blow, but it's not really clear how and if it will affect the overall course of the war.
Is there an argument that this doesn't help Ukraine's case as they continue to plead for permission to use long-range missiles, Storm Shadows and others inside Russia? Could their allies not retort that if you can hit something this far away from Ukraine's borders with what you already have, then you don't really need our help?
Well, I think with or without it, the main argument for using or not using long-range missiles is whether this decision and this escalation, as Russia would see it, would affect the overall course of the war, whether it would actually give Ukraine an advantage serious enough to change the course where the war is headed today. And I think that many people in the West believe that long-range missiles won't do that, because Russia has already prepared to such a circumstance. They have removed a lot of the weapons, some air bases, airplanes had been removed from the areas that could be affected by this long-range missiles. So it's a very serious and fundamental question, and I'm sure that policymakers are weighing all options, and they're making decisions against the background of the war as such.
It does seem clear enough that part of the reason, at least, behind attacks inside Russia's borders, and this certainly applies to Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast, is to demonstrate to the people of Russia that there is a cost to the war that their president is prosecuting in Ukraine. What's your read on the degree to which that percolates through to Russian people? Does this, or is there any chance that events like this do start to make them question their president's judgment?
Well, I think for that to happen, Ukraine would need to scale up its efforts quite dramatically. So far, we have only witnessed what I would call localized events. Even in the Kursk region, they affect about 100 villages and about 500 square miles of Russian territory. But if you take Russia as a whole, and if you take a city like Moscow, for instance, of course, where Russian elites live, most of them at least, for them, this is as far away as Ukraine itself. So I wouldn't say that so far the strikes had really any major effect, especially in view of the fact that the Russian government is firmly in control of the media inside Russia, and that any manifestation of dissent to the Kremlin's line inside Russia carries serious risks for whoever is committing them. So I wouldn't really say that they're producing the effect they do. I was just in Moscow for a few weeks, and that was during the Kursk incursion, and I wouldn't say that people were really discussing it very much.
Ivan Nechepurenko, New York Times reporter, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Time now for a look at the latest business headlines, for which I'm joined by Ewan Potts at Bloomberg. Ewan, great excitement about today's consultations at the US Federal Reserve.
Yes, Andrew, it's Cup final day for financial markets. Perhaps a bit of an exaggeration, but this really is an important one. At 2 p.m. Washington time, 7 p.m. in London, we'll get the latest decision from the US Federal Reserve on interest rates. Now, the reason for the excitement is that the Fed, first of all, is certain to cut US rates for the first time in 4 years. The Fed rate has been at a 20-year high now for more than a year as the US battles inflation, the insane inflation we've seen really around most of the world. But what makes today's meeting really juicy is we're just not certain by how much the Fed will cut by. It's actually the most uncertain meeting since 2007. Investors, based on their positioning in the interest rate swap market, well, they're pretty much 50-50. Half the money is going on a quarter point cut, half the money is going on a half point cut. Economists, and we know they're always right, of course, well, they are overwhelmingly think that the Fed's going to opt to play it safe and go with a more cautious quarter point cut. Now, the reason for the uncertainty is that the Fed is widely seen as being behind the curve on this. There's a feeling that the US economy has been slowing markedly over recent months, and that perhaps they should have cut at the last meeting. Now, let's get this in perspective. The US economy is in a reasonable place. It's still creating jobs. It's not unemployment is not increasing. Well, in fact, the rate of unemployment is increasing, but the number of jobs is still increasing slowly, and GDP is still growing. But there's definitely signs of a slowdown in the US. That's been apparent for many months now. So a lot of economists think the Fed should have already started cutting, and that's why the debate is whether they go in big on this one or if they be a bit more cautious. Of the six rate cutting cycles that have started since 1994, which is when they began publicising all the details, 3 times they've gone in with the smaller reduction, and only 3 times in what you might call crisis times, after the dot-com bubble burst around the financial crisis and during the COVID pandemic, they've gone in with the bigger ones. So take that bit of history and make a judgment yourself.
I mean, another bunch of people who will obviously be paying very close attention to today's decision are office-seeking politicians in the United States. But this close to the election, which is only a couple of months off, does a quarter point or even a half point cut make enough difference in people's wallets and people's paychecks that it might make any difference to how they vote?
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that the Federal Reserve will be conscious that there is an election going on in the United States. Probably difficult to avoid it, certainly is in much of the world as well. Of course, it's tricky for the Fed, isn't it? Because they want to stay out of politics. But the economics of all of this, the data of all of this says that they need to cut interest rates, and they are almost certain to cut interest rates. But it will certainly feature in the US election. I can't help thinking that the Democratic side will take this as a positive. It will lower people's borrowing costs. Although I should point out that mortgages in the US tend to be fixed. So the number of people who are getting lower monthly repayments as of next month will be close to zero. But people will be, on the whole, relieved that interest rates are coming down, unless they've got lots of savings, of course. So this will be seen as a positive for the Democratic side. Luckily for the Fed, their next meeting is on November the 7th, and by then we should know who the next US president is.
And just while we have you here, a story here in the UK, it seems a fairly counterintuitive proposition, but why is Britain's biggest tobacco company lobbying for more, not less, regulation of vapes?
Yeah, a senior executive at BAT, that's the company behind Dunhill, Lucky Strike and Pall Mall cigarettes, amongst other brands, says that the government should be cracking down on illegal vapes rather than introducing more restrictions on cigarettes. In fact, the UK government is planning to do both. One of the key restrictions coming in the UK, it was actually a policy of the last government, which has been brought forward by the current Labour government as well, is that anybody around about who's 14 years old now, by the time they get to 18, smoking will not be allowed for their age group. So as they get older, they will never be allowed to buy cigarettes. So it's a sort of final cut-off point for cigarette sales. The boss of BAT, you're not surprised, won't be surprised to hear, is against that. But he also says there's a big problem with illegal vapes coming into the country. There's been a huge takeoff in e-cigarettes and vaping in the UK, as in many other countries. And BAT would like to see more regulation of those. It's perhaps rather less surprising when you find out that BAT and all the other tobacco giants, most of the other tobacco giants, are also going very big on this place. BAT have got a target to get 50% of their revenues by 2035 from alternatives. So that is a big rise. And Philip Morris International, the big US tobacco giant, it's actually further ahead down this path as well, moving towards non-tobacco alternatives. So the big boys are very much in this market, but they're concerned that there are a lot of illegal products coming in from China, and those are reaching the hands of children.
Ewan Potts at Bloomberg, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. The Parliament of Georgia has passed a new law designed to protect, quote, family values and the protection of minors. Alert listeners may suspect this to be an extremely thinly disguised swipe at the rights and freedoms of gay people, and alert listeners are nigh certainly correct. The law is pretty clearly modelled on something similar on the books in Russia, which among other applications would permit Georgian authorities to prohibit pride events and displays of rainbow-striped flags. Well, I'm joined with more on this by Joshua Kuchera, journalist based in Tbilisi, and Georgi Tabagari, founder of Tbilisi Pride. Georgi, we'll come to you first. What does the passing of this law mean for your organisation? I know you weren't able to have a Pride Week this year, and you've been attacked and harassed in previous years. Is there much future for your organisation beyond this?
Hi, thank you for having me. I believe this is bigger than just one organization or any organization on that matter. It applies to the entire queer community and in a larger sense, entire liberal-minded society who doesn't want to live in the authoritarian regime. And I believe that this bill, if it finally gets adopted, if the current government stays in power, there won't be a future for queers in Georgia for sure, and definitely not for the organizations or Pride or anything on that matter. We see how things are in Russia over the course of several years now, and this law is not just, it's even worse to what Russia has now, and Russia had taken 10 years to get there, and we're literally making this jump on this fascist bill within a couple of months' time, basically, if they stay in power.
Georgie, just to follow that up, is your concern that the real issue here is that the community you represent are the canaries in the coal mine, that they come for you first and they come for everybody else after that?
I think we should look at it on a broader sense and look how generally this issue is being used in the region, and also the way Russia is instrumentalizing LGBT rights. This is not just Georgian case. Because what current Georgian government is doing is exactly similar that Russian government has been doing over the course of past 10 years in Russia, in Ukraine, and they use this issue in their foreign policy basically to scapegoat a community. And this has been previously the case. They similarly, like migrants are scapegoated in Europe, in many countries. In the Russian context, these are LGBT community, and unfortunately, the same methods are applied in Georgia as well by pro-Kremlin government.
Joshua, let's bring you in at this point. There is an election, of course, in Georgia next month on the 26th. Does Georgian Dream, the governing party, believe that there is a constituency among their supporters that this kind of bill will play well with?
Yes, I think so. I think, as Georgi said, this is Georgia's far from the first place to try to scapegoat vulnerable minorities as a means of gaining support for an illiberal government. I think that it's unclear whether there is a big constituency for this. I think they're trying to create the constituency by kind of drumming up kind of homophobic attitudes among Georgian people. But I think it's too early to say whether it's going to work.
Is there any stopping this bill as it is? There are reports that President Salome Zurabishvili has said she will veto the bill, but does that have any effect? Can she be overridden?
Yes, she can be easily overridden. I mean, I think there's been a lot of illiberal laws passed over the past few months, and she's vetoed them all, and then the parliament can override her veto. So that's what will happen this time as well.
I mean, there is a pattern here, as Georgie was saying, of these illiberal laws being passed by Georgian Dream, which does seem to have embarked on a decidedly pro-Russian course in recent months, especially. Do we yet understand what's driving that? Are they actually sympathetic to Putin and Putinism? Are they hoping to forestall any kind of intervention by Russia? Do we know what's behind it?
I don't think we do know what's behind it. And I think to me, a Russian rapprochement or trying to get close to Russia is not quite the right way to look at it. I mean, I think this is above all a domestic political situation. That's what Georgian Dream is concerned with at the moment. And they really want to win these elections. And there's a lot of organizations, NGOs that are very critical of the government, campaigning against the government. And many of these are financed by the West, by the US and the EU. And so this kind of domestic political struggle has become geopoliticized as a result. And I think while a lot's murky, what's very clear is that there is a very strong crisis now between Georgia and the West.
And just finally, on the subject of that election, what are the levels of confidence in Georgia that this election will be a free and fair one in which everybody's vote is correctly counted?
I mean, this is what everybody's wondering at the moment. I mean, in previous elections, they've been somewhat problematic, and there's a lot of, ruling party, whoever the ruling party has been in history, like leaning on people to vote for them. But there's never been kind of wide scale like ballot box stuffing or fraud or things like that. I don't know whether we're going to see it this time or not, but this is the kind of nightmare scenario that people are worried about.
Joshua Kuchera in Tbilisi, and before that, Georgi Tabagari, founder of Tbilisi Pride. Thank you both for joining us. This is the briefing on Monocle Radio. Boeing's current non-golden era is very much ongoing. Around 33,000 Boeing workers have been on strike since Friday in search of higher pay, and what should be the most glorious imaginable advertisement for an aviation company, spaceflight, has somewhat backfired in as much as the two astronauts sent up there aboard the first crewed test flight of Boeing's Starliner capsule cannot just at the moment come back. Well, I'm joined with more on this by the aviation analyst Sally Gethin. Sally, first of all, the strike. Boeing were pleading with their workers last week not to do it. I mean, pleading, that is, short of giving them any more money. But how is Boeing responding to the strike now that workers have walked off?
Yeah, so it was the carrot approach, and now it's the stick, because Boeing has released, or at least it's been leaked anyway, a list of austerity measures it's going to impose on the workforce and the company in light of the strikes. So there's going to be a hiring freeze. There's going to be temporary furloughs, layoffs to some workers. There's also going to be a pause in supplier contracts. So all the various suppliers that rely entirely on Boeing to maintain the supply chain in aviation will see their revenues dwindle, and lots of other little measures like, well, not so little, but no trade shows, no external promotion, pause on ad and marketing spend. So now we're entering a very freezy stage. And I think what's concerning is that the workers did open up. So there is a negotiation phase going on yesterday, and they're due back today around the negotiating table with federal employers, federal mediation. And so far, it's not looking good because the workers have said they don't think Boeing's taken their demands seriously.
How quickly do we get to a point where the slowdown on orders and other costs of this strike starts costing Boeing more than just giving their workers what they wanted?
I mean, I think it'll be immediate in many ways. I mean, airlines won't feel the pinch for a little while. I mean, the peak summer demand is over at this point. You know, it's quietening down anyway. And at the moment, airlines will be able to take delivery of the 737 MAX, the best-selling plane, and the larger 777 and 767 from the existing inventory with Boeing. But, you know, Boeing was already slowing down its production before this due to a cut imposed by the Federal Aviation Administration. You know, we all remember those recent headlines where there was a door blowout on an Alaska Airlines flight in the beginning of the year. So things had already slowed down, and now to freeze it will have a knock-on effect going forward. And of course, the share prices are falling, and its credit rating could be affected if it wants to take out further loans. So it almost looks like it could implode from the inside in the worst-case scenario.
Well, on the subject of worst-case scenarios, though it's not, to be honest, quite a worst-case scenario, though it's not good, especially if those two astronauts up there fall out over a game of backgammon or something. But does an event like that really affect Boeing's business back down here on Earth? It's obviously not ideal, but people do understand that it's spaceflight. Things are going to go wrong.
Yes, we do all understand that the tiniest thing can go wrong with spaceflight, but again, you know, the optics are negative with Boeing. So the fact that those two astronauts were left, well, not quite dangling, but in limbo aboard the International Space Station for months after they expected to be returned home is not a good look. And also, word is coming through today that NASA, which hired Boeing and SpaceX for this sort of orbital taxi service, taking, you know, astronauts back and forwards from Earth to the ISS, is actually not yet decided over a second test flight with Boeing, with the Starliner. So if you know it's failing too dramatically at this stage, then what does that say for the future? Because what they need to do is inspire confidence and get further contracts and further work in space. And that will also offset any other problems that it has within the business. So within the defence sales business and also commercial air transport.
Sally Gethin, aviation analyst, thank you very much for joining us. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Anita Riota. Our researchers were Sana Jumani and Gunnar Grunlid, and our studio manager was Lily Austin. The Briefing returns tomorrow at the same time, midday London. I'm Andrew Miller. I'll be back with The Daily at 1800 London. For now, thanks for listening.